Now, I haven't shared this with you before, but when I was a young child, I was held for ransom, which the fact that I'm here right now tells you that my parents did pay. And what's even more extraordinary is that my parents are now good friends with the man who held me captive at only 1 month of age. And that man, I should say, is to this day a Cohen. And my parents paid him to return me to them because in Jewish law, priests have jurisdiction over nearly all firstborn sons until the completion of a procedure called the Pidyon Haben. And the notion that firstborn sons are somehow sacred or consecrated or treated with esteem did not begin with the Bible. A study of almost every ancient Near Eastern culture makes evident an extensive prevalence of privilege and preference given to firstborn sons. From the Akkadians to the Sumerians and the Babylonians to the Assyrians, firstborn sons were almost universally treated as an elite sector of society, a creed that has persisted through the vicissitudes of history, at least in the West, where the policy of primogeniture has determined the conventions of inheritance, bequests, and succession. And in the last century, one of the founding figures of psychoanalysis proposed what contemporary research seems to have substantiated. Birth order impacts our disposition and our prospects. A 2017 study found that firstborn children are 30% more likely to be CEOs or take a leading role in political life. Just a small sampling of firstborn public figures includes William Shakespeare, Albert Einstein, Winston Churchill, Robert Oppenheimer, Harry Truman, Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Elon Musk, Richard Branson, Jeff Bezos, J.K. Rowling, Oprah Winfrey, Vince Lombardi, and of the first 23 astronauts sent into space by NASA, 21 were firstborn children. And somewhat surprisingly, until Daniel Craig, every one of the actors who played James Bond on film was a firstborn son. And this pattern of elitist treatment and outsized achievement seen across the spectrum of religious and civic society appears to be sanctioned by the Bible, where in the wake of the final plague that ensures the defeat of Egypt and the liberty of slaves, God proclaimed, Kadesh li chol bechor, consecrate to me every firstborn. And to this day, even though I've been redeemed and thus deconsecrated, I have an incredibly rare but nevertheless sacred role to play. In the event that one Yom Tov there are no Leviim in Shul and Kohanim need their hands washed, for duchening, the responsibility falls to the firstborns. As the Mishnah Berurah rules, Keshein Levi, when there's no Levi, Yutzak Bechor, the firstborn pours the water, Dehu Gam Kem Kadosh, because he too is holy. But there is a reason that I, together with every other firstborn, only sits in reserve and functions merely as an understudy to the Leviim. In the text that we read today, something unexpectedly and inexplicably changed. As our census of the nation got underway, God publicly relegated and replaced the formerly consecrated firstborn. He said, Hinei, behold, lakachti et halviim, I now take the Levites, tachat kol bechor, in the stead of every firstborn. So despite being designated as sacred on the eve of our emancipation, we, the firstborn, were demoted and deposed. And this is our question. Why? Why, without warning or explanation, without stated rationale or justification, with no apparent pretext or reason or apology, does God perform a substitution and unseat the firstborn? And there are two resolutions that I'd like to share with you today, starting with our most well-known and prolific commentator, Rashi. And for him, the answer is simple. The firstborns were unseated because of sin, and the Leviim were consecrated as a substitute due to their virtue. In his words, the temple service was initially assigned to the firstborn, but once they sinned with the golden calf, they became ineligible. V'Leviim, and the Levites who did not participate, nivcharu tachtehem, were entrusted with the service in their stead. So for Rashi, it was the firstborn's collective disqualifying behavior that barred them from their otherwise rightful role. The shame and the stain of our failure at Sinai stripped the firstborns of their privilege and position. Instead of pleading with the people to have patience, the firstborn played a part in the betrayal. Instead of leading the people to keep their commitments, the firstborn were complicit in the heathen upheaval. Instead of guiding the people through their time of crisis, the firstborn went quiet and joined the riot. And in the face of this colossal failure, the Levium stood their ground and kept their faith, displaying the traits that made them worthy of being consecrated in the firstborn's place. And it is true that a trace of that preliminary sanctity remains, which requires a ransom and very rarely a responsibility. But the original immaculate consecration is now clouded and blemished with sin. But there is another perspective on this issue, another reading of why firstborns seem to have been unseated from their position of power. For the 13th century French commentator, the Chizkuni, the consecration of the firstborns was always a temporary measure and never meant to last. For him, the notion of firstborns holding ritual public office seems on its face institutionally ludicrous and systemically absurd, the very height of inefficiency, inviting incompetence, ending in a mess. In his words, Im hayu kol bechurim ha'ovdim, if firstborns oversaw all the service, yeh bahem negef, it would lead to catastrophe. By definition, firstborns could not always receive advice or guidance from their fathers or grandfathers and could never be trained by their elder brothers. It is an argument that would produce an overwhelmingly unprepared and ill-equipped workforce that would split families, risk miscommunication, and imperil the conservation of sacred tradition. Intended to be impeccable clockwork choreography, the temple ceremony would collapse into an inexorable tragedy of errors. And beyond the pedagogical deficiencies, the fact that firstborns would grow up in families with attachments to the land might distract their attention from heaven or distort their devotion to a life of transcendent duty. And lastly, for the Chizkuni, the temple work outside of the sacrificial service was principally musical and required a skill set defined by digital dexterity of feel for technical intricacy and the lightest of touches. The delicate craft of strumming a harp or picking a guitar demands nimble, limber, and quick fingers, a facility easily compromised by the routines of an agrarian life, which tend to emphasize strength over precision. If raised in a family of farmers, says the Chizkuni, otav avot v'kashot, they will develop thick or stiff fingers, v'lo yuchal lechofen et hanaval uv'chinor, and be unable to play a lyre or a harp. So for all those reasons and more, the idea that the temple workforce should be comprised of firstborns makes no sense and was never meant to last. And this is a view shared by the medieval master preacher, Rabbi Isaac Arama, who said that the initial consecration was not an ideal, lo haya inyan naot. It was a stopgap, makeshift, interim decision, what he called tzarech sha'ah, a momentary need, until a fitting tribe or family line was identified. And read this way, the consecration of the firstborns was simply a reflection of the ancient Near Eastern standard, a system in need of desperate revision, a deeply defective institution in need of healing and overhauling. In fact, for Rabbi Arama, the systemic privileging of the firstborn had always been a target of biblical antipathy, and our collective father spent his life trying to loosen its grip on the religious and moral imagination. In his words, Hishtadel Yaakov b'chol yicholto, Jacob tried with all his might, levatel koach habechorah, to obliterate the power of primogeniture. And it may well be true that for reasons beyond our control, firstborn children are more likely to lead or predisposed to achieve material success. But that is no way to delegate responsibility which depends on piety or virtue and the pursuit of justice. Martin Luther King was not an eldest child, nor was Thomas Jefferson or JFK or Ronald Reagan or Bill Gates, and for that matter, lahavdil, nor were Yitzchak, Yaakov, Yosef, Moshe, David, or Shlomo. As Vince Lombardi, a firstborn himself, once said, leaders are not born, they are made, and they are made just like anything else, through hard work. Read this way, firstborns were consecrated as a representation of the old world that our ancestors in Revelation sought to perfect. They were selected while heaven waited for a tribe to demonstrate the temperament required to represent heaven. And as Maimonides writes in his Code of Law, a life defined by piety and devotion to the divine call is not determined by birth. He says, Lo shevet Levi bilvad, not only those of the Levite tribe, ela kol ish v'ish mikol ba'ei ha'olam, any person on earth, asher nadvar rucho, who seeks to serve, harizeh nitkadesh kodesh kadashim, can be hallowed as the Holy of Holies. Though in the end the Levium were selected to administrate the Mishkan and then the temple, there is no limit on who can lead people to live lives of purpose. So whether first or last or anywhere in between, we are all born to serve. And may we all find ways to transcend statistics and any other supposed limits. May we all repudiate the idea of fate and embrace a God-given mission to succeed and lead and heal all that we can. Shavua Tov.